Guys, hope you're all well. It's very early over here, so yeah, really excited to share what I've got with you. It's all about stride running power. I spoke with Tom last week, so I put a presentation together. So look forward to kind of sharing some tips and some knowledge which you can take into your training. So I'll just whip up the presentation now. Tom, is there any chance that I could be admin, or is that how it works to share the screen of my presentation?
Yeah, you're good to share, mate. You can, if you hit share screen.
How do I do that? Sorry.
The bottom of the bar, there's a green share screen button.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So I just started. Okay, cool. So, little introduction. I know I've kind of just started off, but yeah, I'm a physical performance coach. At the minute, I start my doctoral degree in September. Currently, I work for the Danish Institute of Sport as the cricket team's head of physical performance. In the last 3 years, what I've managed to achieve is as a Spanish national cricket team's head of sports science, with successful tour to Finland. The year before that, I was the Indonesian under-17 national football team strength and conditioning assistant sports science. So just a bit, of an insight into what I've done. What we're looking at is the question, which I've been kind of asking the last 6-7 months with Run Power, is should we train endurance runners with power instead of the conventional methods we use? So what exactly is power? Well, if you guys are cyclists, you will have used it the last kind of decade upwards, really. So power is force and velocity. We measure it in a unit of watts, and we detect it by using a power meter, which detects the torque and combines it with velocity, and then combines the both, and that's our power measurement. And we use it in sport as what we call an external measure, mainly because it measures just the mechanical properties of the athlete, hence there's no physiological interference in that. And we've got two measures of power which we use. So force times velocity straight is what we call absolute power, which is the total amount of power the athlete produces. And then what we can do is we can break that down. So we take that absolute measurement, force times velocity, but we divide it by the athlete's weight in kilos, and that becomes our relative power, which is measured in watts per kilo. And so watts per kilo is essential in endurance sports and sports which involve a change of terrain and running, because you're carrying the body weight, so it takes into account the mass of the athlete. We use this in football as well because of decelerations. So the athlete's body mass, becoming from a sprint to a stop. So we've kind of got a diagram at the bottom and just summarizes it really. So you've got rider A, whose absolute power is 320 watts. However, weight is 90 kilos. So the power to weight ratio is 3.5 watts per kilo. We've got rider B, which absolute power is slightly less. Sorry, I just knocked that. However, his weight is a lot less. So his power to weight ratio is 3.75 watts per kilo. So even though rider B has got the lesser value of absolute power, because of taking into account rider B would be the more efficient rider due to the relative power in a time trial or a hill sprint. So we've had power in cycling, which is well known and developed since the 80s. And just a bit of a background, it was developed by SRM in 1986. That was the first power meter produced. And then in 89, the uptake in elite cyclists and teams began to use power. Greg LeMond of Team Strawberry started to integrate power training into their racing strategy and training approaches. From that, in 94, the first Olympic team, national team, started to uptake power meters into their racing strategies and training profiles. The US national team in 94. And then in 1999, power meters became more widely used in cyclists, and this was mainly due to the decade worth, of kind of knowledge and racing strategies in elite teams. and also the development of the Power Tap Hub, which made power more affordable for the semi-professional, the amateur cyclists. And then in 2015, the first running power meter was developed, and this was by Stride in Boulder, Colorado. And this is produced for amateur, elite, semi-professional, all ranges of runners. So that's just a kind of brief profile of where we're at with the development of power use in sport. And so in the present day, so figure 1, we've got the Stride Footpod. And I'm not on commission by Stride. I don't work for Stride, so I'm not trying to sell you Stride here, but it fits perfectly on the shoe, as you can see in figure 1. So it's a tiny little Footpod device. And they're designed, like I said, for amateur and elite runners. They cost $200. There are limited studies into running power, and I mainly believe that it was because it was designed and produced in 2015. So we're in the early stages. We're in that 87 to like 89 bracket where we were with the cyclists. And then due to these limited studies and kind of knowledge coming into it, runners still predominantly use their standardized methods to measure training. That consists of RPE, rate of perceived exertion, a minute per mile, and heart rate. So I do acknowledge that further research needs to be conducted into running power, as there is limited. But what I kind of base all my research and my findings off is the cycling studies which have been conducted on top of the limited running studies. And that's mainly because endurance cyclists have similar metabolic and training methods to that of runners. So there's some physiological similarities between cycling and running, and that currently influences my up-to-date practice today. And so the cycling power which I look at, it's been established since the 80s and validated as an accurate training marker. So power in cycling, this was the SRM, has a 3% error margin. It was found and established to be the most effective way to program training. Heart rate, RPE, and power was studied with cyclists. All were found to be effective. However, power was found to be the most supreme measure of training load. So with the limited studies, I mean, what do we know about running power? So in the last five years since running power has been developed, there is several studies which have been practiced independently. And power was found to be a reliable predictor of running velocity in 2018. Power was found to correlate with metabolic increases. So that was on a ramp test. For those of you who haven't had a wonderful experience of doing a ramp test, it's basically on a treadmill, keeps ramping up to the point of failure. And that was conducted with 15 runners. And as their VO2 uptake increased, their power automatically established that and estimated that accurately. And then by Aubrey in 2018, power was significantly correlated with energy expenditure and metabolic demand. And that was done inside and outside as well, so treadmill and outside environment. And then in 2020, this was by the University of Alicante, power was found to only have a 2.8 error margin inside, and then outside it was found to have a 4.3 error margin. And then bearing in mind that cycling power has been established as supreme, that cycling power still has an error margin of 3%. So in the grand scheme of things, power is very, very accurate for the studies which have been conducted. But there are kind of conflicting arguments as always. And, you know, the argument is, are we even ready to use running power? And, you know, mainly probably one of the reasons why no one's really mentioned running power to a lot of runners before. So, you know, in contrast to this, Aubrey, who published the correlation between energy expenditure and metabolic demand, found there was no significant change in VO2 when power readings were compared to treadmill tests and outside tests. So the VO2 estimation didn't actually increase from the treadmill inside to the outside. It stayed the same. And as we all know, running on a treadmill is a lot easier and efficient than running outside. So nothing really changed with the VO2 there. However, Stride did defend this, who stated there was a method flaw, just mainly because the results were taken at different times, and also the division of metabolic rate with speed doesn't actually automatically work out the oxygen cost. So my personal opinion, basing it on on the running and the cycling is the journals which have been published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal and the Journal of Sports Science are very positive. All the studies have got positive points. However, there are issues which have been arising, but based on the effective use in cycling, then running power in the next 5-6 years could be the new, valid training marker to use, which runners can train with. And I do stand by the fact that we're probably in the 1988 to 89 bracket of power development in running, where it was in cycling. So it's all good we talking about this Stride Footpod, but how does it work? Well, if we have a look at the diagram I designed on paint, please ignore how big the Footpod is. It's just there for demonstration purposes. My paint skills aren't top notch, but yeah. So the Footpod sits on top, and it measures using a 3-dimensional space, which recordings are velocity, force, and power, and that's calculated through the foot as it gets closer to the ground. And so that metric of force and velocity is power, and it's measured in our watts calculation. But the bonus is with this Footpod as well, what it gives us as a coach and an athlete, it tells us other calculations such as distance, pace, cadence, contact time, vertical oscillation, and leg spring stiffness. So these readings are what we call kinematic and kinetics. And how accurate actually are they, and what do they tell us? Well, they were validated by using an opto-jump against an opto-jump. And an opto-jump is very similar to a force platform, but it estimates jump height, ground contact times. And we use this in a laboratory environment, so it's been proven to be one of the gold standard methods of measuring. And Stride was found to be an excellent measure of cadence and stride length against the opto-jump. Also, Stride was proven to be a useful tool to measure the following, and this is a useful tool, so it had more of a 3 to 4% error margin, so it wasn't as accurate or excellent as a cadence and stride length of 1%. However, it was proven to be useful at these metrics. So cadence, ground contact time, stride length, and vertical oscillation. And we'll come on to those other metrics, the kinematic and kinetics, a little bit longer down the line, and I'll explain what they are, what they give you as a runner, and what they give us as a coach, and how we can work and build off those metrics. So on the market as well, you'll have heard of Polar's estimation through its watts of power, also RunScribe power meters and Garmin power meters. Well, they were all independently compared on the same study by the University of Alicante, published in the European Journal of Sports Science, and they found that Stride was the most valid marker of running power compared to the three. The other three's relationship with VO2 estimation and repeatability kind of questioned their validity. So Stride was the most recommended tool for measuring running power. And if we have a look at the Polar, the reason for this, it doesn't track additional running efficiency metrics. It's also based off an estimation from the GPS, which is questionable. And also with the GPS estimation, the power function can't be used on treadmill and struggles with errors in areas of poor reception. Also the RunScribe, now this is a really interesting one. So the RunScribe is a dual power meter. I do love the concept. However, the power is still in testing. It's still in beta. But the dual Footpod system allows more metrics than the Stride. So on this one, we have a braking force, foot strike, ground contact times, impact forces, and pronation. So it gives us a lot more information. However, you have got to keep it simple to an extent. How many of those metrics would you actually need and use as a runner and as a coach? Especially in my practice, working with elite athletes in the Danish Institute of Sport, we don't actually run that many tests. We don't have that many metrics. We keep it nice and simple, just for repeatability. So it's really good to have all these metrics, but at the end of the day, we need to keep it simple, we need to keep it accurate, and we need to make sure it's valid. So I do believe that RunScribe has got potential in the next few years, but it needs to go through that beta stage and just more testing into it. So the Garmin have got a single Footpod, and so that's their most valid measure of power. Like the Garmin also measures power through a heart rate, strap estimation through a barometer. But this is there's a lot of inaccuracies with this. Their Footpod was the one tested in the study in 2020 by in the University of Alicante, and that was found to have low repeatability. So let alone their heart rate strap estimation of power. So across the market, if I was going to go for a running Footpod based out of these, I would look towards just the Stride, mainly because of the accuracy and the validity of the unit. So what are the standardized methods used? Well, I briefly mentioned them earlier. So heart rate training, heart rate zones, work 1 to 5. We know it as an internal measure. It was first studied in 1918 by Starling. However, it has a lot of room for error, and a lot of different aspects can affect it. So dehydration increases the heart rate by 7.5%. Heat, humidity, and cold air increase the heart rate by 10 beats per minute. Altitude can increase the heart rate by 20%. Caffeine and alcohol can affect the heart rate response. So if we're just purely training by heart rate, it has a lot of fluctuation with it. So there's a lot of room for error margins. Am I in the right zone? Have I, perceived and looked at this effort? Am I out of the zone? Am I underworking in this tempo workout? And even with training load, heart rate variability can cause inaccurate readings of training load and fatigue, and that was heart rate times duration. So heart rate is a good internal measure. I myself in my practice, I compare heart rate and power, so I use both the metrics together. So I've got a solid external measure of power, and I've got an internal measure of heart rate, and combined they are accurate, but just heart rate on its own, I wouldn't touch it personally. We've got rating of perceived exertion, which is also an internal measure, and that was discovered by Borg in '82. And so, some of the errors associated with RPE is it depends on how you're feeling. So, in a study on the low efforts, athletes underestimated them too low and underexerted, and then on the higher efforts, overtrained and went too hard. Also as a training load measure, which is session RPE times duration. Swimmers are found to the same thing, go too low for low efforts and too high for high efforts, and over a long period of time, over a mesocycle, that either leads to over perceiving the session and leading to overtraining, or under perceiving it, and we don't get any gains through the athlete. So it's very much a give or take depending on how your day's been. If you've had a longer day at work, you've had a tough day, coming back, that 7 out of 10 won't feel like a 7 out of 10 on a Sunday when you've had your feet up for a few hours. It's very much dependent on how your day's been and how your fatigue is, which is a good question. I use rating of perceived effort, but more on a form to ask a wellness questionnaire, to ask how athletes are on a weekly basis, how they're finding their week. So there is a time and a place for rating of perceived effort, but I do suggest that it isn't used to measure session intensity there in the present moment. It's more like a weekly training load monitoring to ask how the athlete is doing that week. Also, what runners use is minute per mile, which is an external measure again. It's very good in football and rugby. We use it with the GPS units. In cricket, we use it with the GPS units. So the way we calculate is use a maximum aerobic speed test. That gives us running pace zones similar to heart rate zones. Then using formulas, we can incorporate these zones. However, for an endurance athlete, I wouldn't recommend minute per mile. It doesn't incorporate the change of terrain. It doesn't incorporate the athlete's internal efforts. It's all well and good on a cricket and football pitch, which is completely flat and the playing surface is standardized. It stays the same. However, using minute per mile for an endurance runner when you're running on, asphalt, stones, grass, it doesn't incorporate that change of terrain or that hill which is coming up. So these are just kind of issues which we have with the standardized methods in running practice at the minute, and where maybe power could potentially fill those gaps to make training more accurate and valid. And so with the relativity, what I just kind of touched on, just this figure shows it really. I mean, if you're a cyclist, you'll know the feeling. So if you have a look at figure 1, you'll have the power in the pink in the watts on the graph, And then also in the red, we have the heart rate. And as you can see, the heart rate traces significantly behind the power of the athlete. So it's not really giving a here and now response. And that's due to, as we can see in figure 3, we've got parasympathetic and sympathetic heart rate responses, which could delay the heart rate for up to 4 minutes. So the delayed relative effort. And then also what we have is an occurrence called heart rate drift, which changes the heart rate also by plus or minus 20 beats per minute. And that happens in exercise lasting to 20-60 minutes despite unchanged work rate. So that's a natural occurrence in endurance runners and endurance athletes anyway. And then we've also got the diagram also explaining that, the potential for stride. It's a relative effort. It measures the force being produced on the ground and instantly feeds back to the watch, and only has a 2.8% variability on the feedback. So, the figure 3 kind of demonstrates where power could potentially fill the relative gap. Also, we've got figure 2, and this is by running with power. It's by a guy called Vance in 2016. I actually had the privilege of speaking to him for 30 minutes last week, and he kind of explained to me his thoughts of power and why he published the book. But this is a really cool diagram, which I like to use, where he even agrees where power could fill the potential gap. We've got power, which is demonstrated by the trace line on the bottom. We've got the pace, which is the second line up. We've got the RPE, which is third, and then the final line is the heart rate. And the athlete is running up the hill on an intense effort and then running down the hill. The power follows and truly represents the hill and the effort the athlete is incorporating. Whereas if you were judging it by pace, the pace would slow down on the hill, not giving a true accurate representation, forcing the athlete to push too hard. The RPE wouldn't really give a true, gives more true representation than the pace. But my theory is it depends on the day the athlete's had, whether it's had a harder day or not. It would perceive that effort harder or easier than it actually is. Heart rate as well, it's a delayed response, so the heart rate takes a while to catch up to the actual delay and spikes that the athlete is actually incorporating. So, if you were to get a running power meter, the next question is how would I use it? Well, this is kind of a practical application which I've used and I've assessed and kind of validated myself off studies, and I know it works best in best practice. So we've got a comparison between cycling FTP and running FTP. So the question is, is running power the same as cycling power? Well, in short, the answer is no, it is different. So to calculate an RFTP in cycling, it's a 20-minute time trial. It's not the best, it's not the nicest of tests, and the average of that 20-minute power is times by 0.95, and that's your functional threshold power for cycling, and it works off a 7-zone system. With running, however, the best practice test to calculate FTP is a 3-minute max effort, a 30-minute active recovery, and then a 9-minute maximum effort. And then you combine the average of both of these efforts, and then 90% of that is your running functional threshold power. So if we kind of compare the two, you've got the running in the yellow and the cycling in the grey. They both work off 7 zones. So, you've got your lower zone 2s, and you've got your anaerobic peak capacity on your zone 7s. However, what you'll notice if we look at the percentage of a zone, the percentage of the zones are different and they vary a lot. And that's to incorporate eccentric efforts, which are predominantly in running, also biomechanical factors, which are in running, and then running as well is a physiological, higher demanding sport than cycling. And also cycling, you can coast as well when you're cycling. So running power incorporates all these efforts and these factors. And that is why the running power is slightly different, as you can see percentage-wise in the time held compared to cycling power. Just a different sport in a few ways. And so why FTP? So cyclists out there, would hear of critical power tests. And if I had a cyclist, I would go to the critical power test straight off. I wouldn't do the FTP. However, in running, the critical power test hasn't been validated as much as it has done in cycling. It's very new, the critical power run test. We did use it in football for a stage where we did CP tests, but now the go-to is more of a mass test. Basically, there was found to be a lot of inaccuracies with critical power tests in team sports, and the same with running critical power. For me, it's not been validated enough. So my go-to would be the RFTP. And that was also backed up in a study in 2019 where the RFTP test was found to have the lowest margin of error and also correlated with metabolic demand with a diminutive error margin. So that's my first step, calculate the zones of the athlete and where he or she is going to train at. So my practical application is my programming. So, this is a template and it runs in line with UKSCA endurance standards, which is the governing body of strength and conditioning in the UK, which is where my standards are set to. And I've basically swapped the heart rate zones to power zones just as a demonstration. So they're in line with Vance's book Run with Power. As we can see on Monday as an example, we've got a general aerobic 4-mile run, and that's 81 to 88% of the athletes' RFTP. You've got the strides on the Saturday on week 3, and they're 550-meter strides at 129% of RFTP. So, as a programming aspect as an athlete to see this, as long as the athlete knows their RFTP, what that number is, it's very easy to program training to and adhere to those training zones, making training more accurate, especially with the strides. That's a good session to base a study off. The heart rate wouldn't pick that up at all. There might be a few spikes in the heart rate data, but power for sure on the 5 times 50 meter stride would be the most accurate measure to use based on the distance and the time and the intensity the athlete is running for. And then my third step of practical application is training load monitoring. So this is a screenshot of Stride Zone software. It's their Power Center, it's called. And, it's the same as your Garmin, your Stat Sports, your Player Tech. It's just Training Peaks. It's just a training software. This Power Stride can connect to Training Peaks, can connect to Strava, connects to Garmin. So it's very adaptable. So it's just a screenshot which I've used, but it's very adjustable to what software you upload it to. And so if we have a look at the trace, it demonstrates what the power is at the relative time. You can go back and look at it. We've also got heart rate and pace on there. As I mentioned earlier, for my best practice, I combine heart rate and power for the most accurate reading. We've got the training load, which is a running stress score, and that's calculated by 100 times training duration times power divided by critical power. And this is already done. This measurement is already devised by Stride. It's a nice measurement to use, but I don't use it, mainly because I come back to my point where critical power isn't that developed in running for us to work off. So the training load, I currently have to work off heart rate training zones. It's not the most accurate, like I said. I would prefer to work off power, but we're not really there at the stage yet to work off, off the critical power, in my opinion, for running to calculate this calculation. So heart rate is the next best thing. And then if we look at figure B, that's just a demonstration of how we can, if we were to use it, how we to use a running stress score to plan and periodize a mesocycle, so a training cycle of an athlete. And you can see the weeks where we taper, the weeks where we peak, and it just gives a bit of feedback to say where the athlete is at and how fatigued they should be, just so we can get the athlete in the right amount of miles of the right intensity, so the athlete can progress and taper accordingly for competition. At the bottom as well, we've got kinematic and kinetic readings. So these are the readings which I was on about. So the first reading straight up is the average power. So it's 250 watts. Obviously we can divide that by, this was a run I did myself. It's not the fastest to run, but I don't like picking other people's run data apart. So I went out and did a run just so I could pick it apart a little bit. So we've got my average power. If I was to divide that by my body weight, it would get watts per kilo. My pace was 8 minutes 32 per mile. Definitely not my fastest run. The elevation was 405 feet. So this is the parts where I can start picking myself apart. So my cadence was low. So for my height, this is instantly telling me my cadence was too low. I'd look for a cadence of around about 178 for my height. So already as a coach, it's giving me feedback for kinematic and kinetic readings for my athlete. So if this was my athlete I was coaching, I'd look to integrate kind of training drills into their warm-up to start to increase their cadence more. Heart rate, obviously internal measure. We've got my form power, which is how much power I'm wasting, which is 73 watts. And the wastage of power is due to biomechanical inefficiencies. So that's another point I can come across. It might be a case of looking more at arm drive, more, potentially if I increase my cadence, that number would come down. Also, we've got my ground time, which is very slow. So that's the time I make ground contact time with on the floor. So it's 263. We'd look for well below like 230, 240. So, ways I can do that is get more in the gym, do more strength-based training. Also, my leg spring stiffness. It's on the lower side. I generally look for 10 to 14, so it's 10.5. That would come with more kind of strength-based drills in the gym. So that number would increase, and that's the strength which goes through my leg to decelerate my torso before I push myself off again. Also, we've got vertical oscillation. So as an endurance runner, you still want a bit of vertical force, but you want it to be predominantly horizontal. And so that's not actually a bad reading. To give myself credit, that's 6.9 centimeters. So you generally look between 6 and kind of 10 centimeters of vertical oscillation. So that's the bobbing up and down. You don't really want any bobbing up and down. You want as much horizontal force as possible, so you're not wasting watts going up in the air. And then at the bottom as well, we've got times in the zone, and that can kind of tell me if the athlete has hit. So if I was to prescribe a zone 2, I'd want to see at least kind of 80% of that power in the zone 2. Obviously, for this run was just a maintenance run, so I was all over the shop, but it just demonstrates of how the zones can give you feedback. As heart rate, as you would see with your heart rate zones which you use, running power would give you the same kind of feedback by tracking your time in the zone and giving you a percentage of your session, just to see if you've hit target with that zone 2 or zone 3 run, for instance. So really, just to conclude, why should I use power instead of heart rate to train with? Well, power has been proven a valid measure in cycling since the 80s, and among most cyclists now is assumed pre-measure of choice. It's relative with no delay in feedback, gives an honest response with no interference, and for best practice, I combine it with heart rate as an internal measure and power as an external measure. So I've got the internal and external. It gives us also kinematic and kinetic information, and the cadence is what we go on to as well. It's to reduce, we could use it to reduce injuries. A lower cadence adopted has been found to have a higher increase of injury potential in runners. So you want to get that cadence as close to optimal for the athlete's leg length as possible. Practical considerations into your training. Well, Stride power meter only costs $200. So in the grand scheme of things, comparing it to cycling power meters, it's not anywhere out of the world with regards to price. With a 3-step process I use, which we just went through, which was the test, the program, and the assess. Power is easy to use for coach and athlete. So what I would suggest is swap the heart rate zone training and minute per mile training for power zone training to prescribed training, and then use the heart rate as well to monitor that training against the power as well as an internal measure. The testing of the RFTP takes 42 minutes and needs to be tested every mesocycle. So every kind of 6 weeks, your power zones need to be reassessed via the RFTP to see what adaptations we've had. And future considerations for power and heart rate, and this is kind of what I'm looking into, what a lot of people are kind of studying and looking into, and it's utilizing the heart rate and power relationship to assess training and management. And this is something which we call heart rate drift. And we've got the figure 1, which demonstrates this, and it's a reduction of stroke volume where cardiac output rises to maintain the same blood flow. And so this reduces the performance by the heart rate having to beat higher to maintain the same effort, and it causes a 9 to 19% reduction in VO2 max, leading to exercise being perceived harder. And this is caused predominantly by overheating, dehydration, and glycogen depletion. So for you guys out in the UAE, especially in summertime, this would be something which I'd be inclined to look into. how does power give us more of an honest response during those days where it's over 35 degrees and it's very, very hot. And I've drawn on the graph on figure 1. This was a study in 2016 cyclists, and I've drawn on an orange line just to seem like that's my assumption of where running power would be, and it would be as a fatigue, the pace and the power would drop, but the heart rate would stay the same. But with cardiac drift, what we would see or might see or should see is the heart rate rising, but the power and the pace staying the same, and the heart rate rising and going through the roof for the same relative running power measurement and the same relative pace. And so by using the internal of the heart rate and the external of the power, we'd be able to see that and assess whether the athlete is going through cardiac drift or is just fatigued during their run. And so that's the question, would combination of running power and heart rate be an accurate indicator of heart rate drift? And how could we utilize it in training? That's kind of what I'm looking into next. And probably the number one reason why power would be more beneficial to you guys training out in the heat. There could be a more valid measurement with running power than what you've got with your heart rate and your minute per mile. So yeah, guys, if you've got any questions, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts, what you guys think, and any questions you've got related to training.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. We have got some questions in the chat. So I will just say who's asked it, and then you can ask. So just unmute yourself to ask. Captain Hendy, do you want to go first? You've got a question in there.
All right. So using power with the bike, I'm a big convert and believer in that. What's the big challenges that you still have to overcome to using power in running? What are the technical challenges that you think stand in the way, if any?
Yeah, good question. I think that's the main reason why it isn't so widely adopted. It's mainly due to the lack of research. It's very much in the 80s, like the 80s era, about 88 to 89, in comparison to the development of cycling power. There's not a lot of studies into it, and the studies which are all positive, like I said, which is kind of my tipping point. But there needs to be more research. We don't know enough about it. However, my argument is that a stride power meter only costs $200, but it gives we already know that it gives more accurate information potentially than heart rate. However, it's not there's not enough really into testing the zones, how accurate it is. There needs to be more studies conducted, and this will happen over the next kind of 4 or 5 years. We'll see a change in uptake in runners and more studies which come out. So kind of a reason for this, and the reason why I use it is with competitive athletes, you have to always be on the forefront of different training methods, and so this is my kind of being on the forefront of the training methods with the stride. That's why I use the power really, to get an advantage, because I definitely see this in the next 4 or 5 years being the number one training measure in runners.
So you're using the analogy of cycling power in the 1980s as where you're at. Is that the case technologically as well? Because there was a lot of A, expense, but B, considerably lower accuracy in the late 80s in cycling power than there is now.
Yeah, so with the expense, the stride is only $200. So like in the grand scheme of things, comparing it to the 80s, it's a lot better value than what you would get with the cycling power meter. You are right with the accuracies. Inside to outside comparison, there was a difference. We are at the 4% margin outside of an error. So as we go along, the device will become more accurate. Stride started off in 2016 with like a chest, their 15 model, like an arm model, which sat on the arm, and then it developed into like a chest strap, similar to what Garmin have got their device, their other device, and that had more inaccuracy than this. So kind of a streamlined from an arm-based power meter to a chest strap power meter to now a power meter which sits on as a Footpod on the shoe. So over the last 5 years, we've seen the development of what the device is kind of going into, really.
Okay. Well, just one last one, and then I'll shut up.
Yeah.
From a practical point of view, is the Footpod going to talk to my Garmin watch without any dramas, or do I have to sort of try and amalgamate a different set of stats into what I'm using with the Garmin?
Yeah, no, good one. So, me for an example, I use the Garmin Forerunner watch. I've got it on now. It's a Forerunner 235. So yeah, it works perfectly. All you have to do is go on Garmin on your Connect, download. If you type in Stride now, you might be able to see it. If you like a Stride app, you just plug your watch in, and then it just downloads some new software to your Garmin watch, and then you're good to go. It works via Bluetooth, so you just have to turn your Bluetooth on your Garmin watch, and the new software, when you go on the run, so you press your run screen, and there'll be like a new display where, as well as heart rate, it will display power, and then you can for me, what I love about the Stride power meter is the cadence. So I'm going back to fitness, but my cadence is still really low, as you saw on that graph. But for me, it gives, instead of estimating with my arm swing like a Garmin watch would do without the power meter, it gives me more accurate and relative readings of cadence on top of my power reading. So that's another bonus to the Stride power meter.
All right, thanks very much.
No
awesome presentation.
Thank you.
Stuff. Jeff, you had some questions around how it measures vertical oscillation. Do you want to ask that away, or has it been answered?
That was quite interesting. I was interested to know what he would focus on as a coach, if he noticed a lot of that, what he referred to as bobbing, so that that vertical movement as opposed to the horizontal movement, and is that a bigger factor than, for example, the cadence or anything else like that? How does that work?
Yeah, no, good question. So vertical oscillation has been linked to cadence. So, for instance, a lot of bobbing is associated by slower cadences. And then also, so generally speaking, if the athlete has got like a cadence of 160, you generally find the vertical oscillation to be higher. You could speed up their cadence through drills, running drills. So like, scissor kicks, A skips, B skips, fast feet, heel kicks. Then you generally kind of find with that increase of cadence, the vertical oscillation would decrease. I've done that with a lot of runners I've worked with. I focused on doing kind of 20-minute drills. And then you generally find that they take that into their running practice, a higher cadence. So like I do fast feet drills in the warm-up with them, and generally find that we look to increase their cadence by kind of 2 to 3% kind of each couple of weeks, and over time with the increase in cadence, their vertical oscillation will decrease. That's what I found myself. There are studies to say that it links to cadence. So yeah, if you've got a high cadence and a high vertical oscillation, what I would do is the same kind of drills, but focusing on keeping the feet and watching just cues generally. So just cueing the runner. So just saying, watch that bob and try and keep us horizontal, moving forward, push off behind you as much as you can, so to speak. And over time with cueing and coaching, you'll find that number kind of decrease.
Cool. Mr. Winter, your question is bike related.
Yeah, going back to morning Rob. Going back to one of your first slides, comparison between rider A and rider B.
Yes.
In the case of rider A's power increasing such that his watts per kilo is then the same as rider B, who would be quicker over, let's say, a 20k TT, flat TT, no wind? Is it going to be, is rider A and B going to be the same speed, or would rider B be faster because he's lighter?
If it's flat, then they'll both be the same. As long as the relative power to weight is exactly the same. I mean, if rider A keeps his higher absolute power reading, then rider A would be quicker because he's got a higher absolute power in his bank if he needs to do like a 5 or 10 second sprint on the flat, so towards the finish line. So if I'd go for rider A based on that fact, really. I mean, in a time trial, there's more things to put into consideration. I haven't worked with cyclists. I've worked more in team sports, but you yourself as a cyclist, there's loads more factors to put into that. To be honest, it was just a pretty cool example, just to kind of display the need for relative power. But yeah, good question. I'd say based on that, rider A for sure.
Thanks.
It's not an excuse to put weight on, mate. Sorry. All right, last question, Rob Jones.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, obviously you've pitched the stride quite well there today, but are there any other power meters out there that are going to have the same level of technology or have the same accuracies, the same metric data? As I've been looking at a few recently, but Stride obviously seems to jump out as the main one.
Yeah, so back on the slide, we had the Garmin, the RunScribe, and the Polar. I do like the RunScribe. I think the idea behind it is nice. It's got a parameter on each, on each leg. So I like the idea of that because the way it works with Stride is it estimates the other leg based on the leg you're measuring. However, like I said, it's still in beta, and I can send you the presentation. But on the next page of this one, there's a list of references. So the reference list will come up from the independent study by the University of Alicante, which compared them all. And Stride was found to be the most accurate and correlated the best to metabolic demand. Just based off purely an independent published study, I'd still stand by the Stride. I think the others are a little bit behind where Stride is. With Garmin's estimation, Polar estimates, but the RunScribe has got potential, but it's just too new. So if I was going to invest, a few hundred into a power meter, I'd go Stride just purely based on the independent studies and the validity of what those studies said about it.
Cool, thank you.
No worries.
And I just have one last one to kind of generally wrap this up. Who of runners, what levels should be thinking about running with power? Yeah,
good one. So like with the cycling, what we saw is over the period of 10 years, like a decade, is it went from highly elite to semi-pro. That was mainly due to the cost and due to kind of the knowledge increasing around power and it going more public. But Stride from the offset was kind of out there and can be used by any level of runner. And that's why the affordability of it is still very reasonable for what the unit actually does. So I'd say for everyone, if you've got the funds and you've got the software as in a Garmin watch or a Polar watch to connect a Stride power meter to, I'd say use it for sure. There's plenty of books reading material out there. Coaches are knowing a lot more about what Stride does. So yeah, I'd definitely recommend it for all levels of running because it will just change your training. And we're all kind of short for time and we want to get the most amount of gains out of what little time we have to train. And it's the same with like elite athletes. We're always looking for those little gains. And if we can get quality more than quantity, we're going in the right direction. And I believe that Stride and a power meter for running can do that.
Brilliant. Good. Well, thank you very much, mate, for coming on and presenting that.
No, thank you, guys.
Definitely interesting to look into. And yeah, all your points are pretty valid. I have one athlete using a Stride pod who I coach, and I don't program it for every run, but it's always good to see the data and be able to track data a little better. And he actually moved from the UAE over to Canada. So in terms of looking at data in temperature differences was quite interesting with his heart rate and his pacing, but the run power data didn't change too much. So it is definitely an interesting metric to look at. I wonder if we'll see it more and more as the years go on. that is it for today, folks. If you have any more questions, you can send them, just send them over to me in an email, tw@innerfight.com, and I'll get them on to Rob and can get back to you with an answer. If you think of something later in the day, then just by all means send it over. And yeah, thanks again, Rob.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for having me. All the best, and yeah, thank you, guys.
Good.
Thank you.
Right, guys. Enjoy your last day of Eid. Relax. Have a day off. Do your training. That's it. See you.
Cheers, guys. Bye.